I remember the first time I saw a Katherine Howe novel. It's such a core memory, and so don't freak out, because it's 2009, I was in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and I was in a Barnes & Noble, and they had one of those Book of the Month things. Now, this is the OG Book of the Month. This is way before all the celebrity ones. This was on a stand, and it was the Physic Book of Deliverance Dane, and it was all about the Salem witch trials. I don't know about you, but I have certain subjects in history that I obsess over, and one of them is the Salem witch trials, which is odd because I am from a small town in Wisconsin, so not sure why. I think it's because I was obsessed with the Wicked Witch of the West, so maybe it's something to do with that. Anyway, I devoured the Physic Book of Deliverance Dane and became such a fan of Katherine. So I am thrilled to have her here for the Nantucket Book Festival this year.
Thank you, Tim. I'm thrilled to be here.
Katherine is a best-selling and award-winning historian and novelist who is a direct descendant of a 19th century sailor who battled pirates on the high seas, as well as 3 women who were tried for witchcraft in Salem. Katherine is the author of the Physic Book of Deliverance Dane, The House of Velvet and Glass, the young adult novels Conversion and the Appearance of Annie Van Sinderen, and the co-author with Anderson Cooper of the New York Times bestsellers Astor and Vanderbilt. She is also the editor of the Penguin Book of Pirates and the Penguin Book of Witches, which are worth the price of the book for her forewords alone. Her newest novel is a mystery adventure set in the golden age of piracy called A True Account. She holds a BA in art history and philosophy from Columbia and an MA in American and New England Studies from Boston University.
And in the fall, I'll have my doctorate at last from the University of East Anglia.
Oh, congratulations.
Thanks.
I didn't get
Never
that
too
right
late.
in. I didn't get that right in for your bio. Co-writing with Anderson Cooper. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, I threw you off.
Oh, that's okay.
That was on me.
I am going to... There we go. She lives in New England with her family, where she is at work on her next book. One time as a child, she looked up into the eye of a hurricane, and she puts hot sauce on everything. Please welcome Katherine Howe.
I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you. I'm sorry I threw you off.
Oh, no. Okay, I want to start with that looking up into the eye of a hurricane, because I feel like there's a story there.
I don't know if it's much of a story, but a lot of people don't know this because I write mostly about New England and New York City, but I am not from New England or New York City. I am from Houston, Texas. I'm from the Gulf Coast. I'm from a big new South city. And one of my core memories, interestingly enough, is when I was about 6 years old, a Category 3 hurricane called Hurricane Alicia came over Houston. And of course, we've had many dramatic hurricanes since then. But Alicia came over us, and the eye was going to pass over us. And I distinctly remember, I grew up in a little 1940s bungalow, which has since been torn down because the average lifespan of any building in Houston is 20 years, which is astonishing. So I was in this 1940s bungalow where I'd grown up, and I was with my mother and father, and we had no power, and we were kind of like in a bedroom or in one of the back rooms of the house. This is a really little bitty house. And in the back of the house, my parents had added on like sliding glass doors to the backyard. They'd like pushed out into a porch and made sliding glass doors. And I remember this distinct discussion between my mother and father because my father wanted me to see the eye of the hurricane, and my mother was worried that it would be dangerous, that we would be going close to the plate glass window.
Sounds dangerous.
Yeah, it does sound kind of dangerous. Well, somehow my father persuaded her, and it's one of those things. I don't know if this is the case for you all, but you have a childhood memory, and you're not sure if you're actually remembering it or if you've told yourself the story so many times that that's become the memory. But who knows? But I remember the way I remember it is going with my dad through our darkened house, approaching the plate glass window, being very mindful that this was like a very dangerous thing that I wasn't supposed to be doing, looking through the plate glass window with my dad. And did you know that the weather in the eye of a hurricane is perfect and sunny and clear? And so I remember this like driving rain, and then all of a sudden sunshine. Sunshine opens, and you can see this circle of the eye over your head, and then it just for a couple of minutes, and then driving rain. And so it's one of my core memories. How
old were you again?
I was 6.
Okay.
I was
I
6.
feel like maybe this set you on the path to be a creative. Even telling this story is creative. So let's dig in there a little bit. You write historical fiction. I want to know a little bit about your history and if you remember the first story that you really put pen to paper.
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. Well, I wrote as a child. Like, I think a lot of writers write as children. And I wrote so much that I didn't notice that that's what I was doing. Like, I didn't realize that that was my special thing that I had because it was as natural to me as anything else. I thought my special thing was music. I was a very serious double bassist, oddly, for a time. That's how I got into college. I know. Are you laughing because I'm tall and skinny? I know. Someone once remarked that in high school when I was playing double bass, I looked like a vine coiled around it, which I thought was a very funny way to do it. Anywho, but I never thought that I'd be able to write fiction as an adult. I think probably my first juvenilia that might be worth reading, who knows, now I'm going to embarrass myself, is a short story that was published in my high school literary magazine, which was about Thanksgiving. And one of my friend's mothers sent me a note saying that it reminded her of Edith Wharton. And I think that's the first time that I had ever heard of Edith Wharton.
What a compliment.
I know. It was well, I didn't even understand what a compliment it was because I was a 17-year-old teenager and smug and impossible. And so that's probably my first real it was sort of like a social moment, a family portrait kind of snapshot in time. And I didn't start writing fiction for real until I was in graduate school, studying American and New England studies.
So let's go even further back, because this is the question I can't wait to ask you. You are a descendant of Elizabeth Proctor, who survived the Salem witch trials.
Yes.
And Elizabeth Howe, who did not.
And you know what? And this is so funny. This may not have made it into your thing. Also, Deliverance Dane. Isn't that crazy? Which I did not know when I wrote that book. I only figured it out like 5 years after the fact, one day playing around on Ancestry. My brain exploded and dripped down the walls.
I mean, history is truly raging through your blood right now, I feel.
There's the best historian of the Salem witch trials, if you don't know this already, is a woman named Mary Beth Norton, who at this very moment is over on Martha's Vineyard, and I was trying to persuade her to come to the festival, but sadly she couldn't. She is an emerita professor at Cornell University, and she wrote a book called In the Devil's Snare, which is fantastic. If you haven't read it, and if you're in the mood for some history, it's very readable. And one of the things that I love about her is that she says the more you study witchcraft, the more superstitious you become.
And is that true?
I mean, I think that's been my case. Certainly I felt that way when I just randomly stumbled upon the fact that I'm actually more closely related to Deliverance Dane than I am to Elizabeth Howe, even though we have the same name.
Wow. How did you stumble across these connections in your family? Did you always know about them, or?
My aunt figured those out. Elizabeth, the two Elizabeths. That was my dad's sister figured that out in the 90s. And to her credit, I mean, that was hard to do in the 90s. Like, everything's very digitized now. It's actually a lot easier to be interested in family history than it was. But of course, as a teenager, as an impossible teenager, I thought that was the most metal thing I'd ever heard. I thought it was super, I loved it. But I didn't think about it in any kind of structured or interesting way. It was just one of those fun facts about yourself.
So when did you decide I'm going to write about that?
So my husband and I were in graduate school at the same time. He's a historian. He was at Harvard and I was at BU. We were living in Harvard Square, and graduate school, are there any survivors of humanities grad school? No. Well, see, you're all smarter than I am. It's kind of an intense situation. And so we'd been living in the square for a number of years, and we just needed to a change of scene. And kind of on a whim, we moved to Marblehead, Massachusetts, which is where we still live, by the way. And Marblehead has the largest collection of extant 18th century houses in the whole country. They have even more than Colonial Williamsburg, which is stunning to me. And so, as you can imagine, I arrived as a history person, an arts and culture person. I arrived, but with the eyes of someone from a new South City where houses are demolished after 20 years. I think if I had grown up, we were just talking about this backstage, I think if I'd grown up in a place as storied and historic as New England is, I think I would have taken it a little for granted. But arriving from my big asphalt jungle that I grew up in, everything looked so strange to me and so fascinating and so interesting. And the genesis for Physic Book of Deliverance Dane came about because we were living on the second floor of a house that was built in 1705. And the floors, we had those wide pine floorboards that are like this wide. And the ceiling was so low that if I took a sweater off over my head, my hands would hit the ceiling in our bedroom. And because we were in grad school, we were broke as church mice, and so we kept the thermostat at 55. And so our bedroom was tucked in the back of the house, and we would actually get ice on the inside of the window, on the window pane. This is when I learned that headboards actually have a function beyond being merely decorative. It's that they keep your head warm. If you have a headboard against the wall, we did not. We were sleeping on my
Is
futon.
that just true, or did you say that to make yourself feel better because you're freezing?
I mean, I think it's true. I stand by it because that was when I discovered that sleeping on a futon with your head against a wall, ice on the window, it's actually a very cold experience. But Marblehead, as you probably know, is right next door to Salem. And Salem today, is a very fun place at Halloween, and there's like lots of sort of witch kitsch, but there's also increasingly more kind of focus on the historical aspects of what happened at Salem. And I started thinking about the fact that I felt like every version of the Salem story that we're all familiar with, I think most of us first encounter Salem through the Crucible. That's certainly how I first encountered it. And I felt like the two perspectives on witchcraft that we would get, especially in fiction or in popular culture, were either skeptical accounts that treated everyone living in the past like they were naive idiots, like in The Crucible, or kind of fantasy, pointy hat, Harry Potter type stuff. And I felt like because I am from the Gulf Coast, I'm from a region of the world where our narrative tradition is actually magical realist. Houston is right at the intersection of like Tejano and Mexican styles of storytelling and Southern folktale styles of storytelling. That's the stuff that I grew up with. And so it was striking to me that here was this moment in time when people really believed that magic was real. Like they really believed it, and they were not uneducated. They were not delusional. They occupied a very different intellectual and religious and moral landscape than the one we live in today. And I felt like I hadn't seen a story that tried to look at what magic would be like if it were real the way the colonists actually believed it to be. And it felt very organic to me to write a magical realist story that looked at those questions.
I remember my husband and I went to Salem maybe 2 years ago, and you just feel the history there so much.
Yeah.
So I shared that obsessed with the Salem witch trials. The next obsession that I have in the literature history that I get so excited about is the Titanic. And lo and behold, Katherine's second novel is called The House of Velvet and Glass, and it's all set on the Titanic. I was like, is this lady reading my mind?
I'm frightening, Tim. And I have a character in The Appearance of Annie Van Sinderen who's from Wisconsin.
Yes. So, I mean, are you Elizabeth Howe or Katherine Howe?
Not telling.
So what was the purpose of Titanic and to set your second book there?
So House of Velvet and Glass it's set in Boston in 1915. So that I'm interested in moments in time when we are undergoing a pretty radical change. And the 19 teens was really interesting to me because I feel like most of us have a mental image of the 1920s. Like if I invited you to a 20s party, you'd know to wear spats and a boater, and you'd know the music and the cocktails. But if I say to you 1915, I would imagine it's a little bit harder to conjure what that means or what it feels like or how it is different from, say, 1925. And the 19 teens is a really interesting moment because on the one hand, it is the 20th century, but it is still in many respects beholden to the 19th century. And so it is also a moment when modernity was beginning to change the way people understood how the world worked. And so there's a thread in The House of Velvet and Glass that is about seances, because the 19-teens following World War I was a moment of a flowering of belief in spiritualism and seances. And there was a moment in time, like it's hard to imagine that William James, big psychologist William James, was so convinced, Harvard professor, so convinced that we were on the brink of proving the existence of life after death scientifically, that he staked his whole career on it. He was one of the founders of the American Society for Psychical Research. Like, actual research was taking place at Harvard into the phenomenon of persistence of consciousness after death. Like, this is a very different moment. And it's also a different moment when our understanding of time is starting to change with automation and with modernity and with also changes in transportation, things like that. And there's a kind of a crisis of masculinity that's happening in the 19 teens as well. So I was interested in I wrote a story about a Boston Brahmin family, the Alstons. And Sybil Alston is a woman who is kind of on the brink of being a spinster in the 19 teens, who lost her brother on Titanic. And so it sort of has to do with, lost her sister on Titanic. I haven't looked at the book in a while. But her brother was a Harvard undergrad and had fought in World War I and things like that. So it's a story very much about Boston on the cusp of the modern.
I mean, I loved it. I highly recommend it.
And there's a twist, but I don't want to give the twist away.
Yeah, let's not. So we have Witch, we have Titanic, now we're on to pirates. So in your foreword to the Penguin Book of Pirates, you say, "We are romantic about pirates in part because we don't know anything about them." Can you explain?
That's true. I mean, I think that part of it is that we have a picture of what pirates look like. And I think for most of us, that picture comes from Captain Hook. You know, like you picture the flowing Restoration era wig. There's a certain degree of glamour that we like to attach to pirates. And I'm a sailor. It's my only hobby. And which is why when people ask me, how did you become interested in pirates? I thought, how can you not be interested in pirates? Everyone's interested in pirates, aren't they? But as I started reading primary sources to prepare for a true account and to put together the Penguin Book of Pirates, I was stunned to discover the extent to which Golden Age piracy, so piracy in the late part of the 17th century and into the 18th century, when we really picture pirates, Blackbeard, all of these guys, Golden Age of piracy, all of that enterprise was absolutely bound up with the transatlantic trade and enslaved people, which to a degree that really shocked me, actually, when I was reading some of the primary sources. Like, you kind of maybe understand that in the abstract, but seeing it spelled out the way that it was really stunning to me. And so one of the things that's fascinating to me about pirates is we romanticize them because they represent this goal of self-determination and freedom and complete freedom. And, of course, pleasure, riches, drink, women, all of the things that we all secretly wish that we could throw over reality for and go in pursuit of. But in truth, there was a brutality at the center of it, and within that brutality was the most radical condition of unfreedom. And so there's a real tension at the story of the Golden Age of piracy that I wasn't even aware of until I started doing the work towards this book.
So it's set up as a dual timeline. So you have two different times. How is that? And a lot of your books have that. How does that work in your craft to write that? Do you write all one timeline and then go back, or do you go back and forth?
Yeah, it's funny. I've discovered, to my shock and perhaps dismay, or also maybe delight, it's complicated, that I'm a mid-career novelist now. When you're a mid-career novelist, you discover that you have certain narrative traits. And I've discovered that one of my traits is absolutely two timelines. And I think part of the reason for that is because when I'm writing about a more remote time, like the Salem witch trials, or like a true account opens in Boston in 1726, which is like one generation after the Salem witch trials, so still rather remote from the world that we inhabit today. I've discovered that I like to have a kind of a modern person, a more modern person who can kind of translate what's happening in the past for us. And so I also like to write about students, professors, someone whose job it is to think about the more remote period of time in the book. And that's true in a true account. So a true account begins in Boston in 1726 with a girl named Hannah Missouri. And she is, her name is taken from a real person, but she herself she's a fictional character. But she is present at the hanging of a pirate named William Fly, which really happened in Boston in the summer of 1726. And she then gets caught up in some intrigue and has to disguise herself and flee for her life. And then about 40 pages in, you realize you're actually not just following along in the action of a book, you've been reading over someone's shoulder. And that person's shoulder is a woman named Marion Beresford, who's a professor at Radcliffe in 1929. And so, but you asked me, how does that work craft-wise? Believe it or not, I write in order. I write the whole book in order. So I will outline first. So I don't write one timeline and then the other. I will write them in order, which means that when I'm in drafting mode, I'm a little difficult to have a conversation with.
You're like, wait, what am I? Where am I?
Who am I?
What else is unique about you is you also have all these different aspects of your publishing life. You have historical fiction, you have young adult, you co-wrote Astor and Vanderbilt with Anderson Cooper, and then you are the editor of those two Penguin Book of Pirates and Penguin Book of Witches. Most times in publishing these days, I feel like someone sees something in an author and it's like, you have to stick with that and give me that each time. Why is yours so unique? How did that happen?
I think maybe I'm just a little bit lucky. I mean, part of the way that the YA books came about was, so I wrote Physic Book, and I wrote The House of Velvet and Glass, and then Penguin Classics actually came to me about Penguin Book of Witches, because they had seen Physic Book, and they said, would you like to do an edited volume on witchcraft? And I said, heck yeah. The fact that I didn't know how to do that didn't stop me. It took me many years and many false starts before I actually learned what I was doing. But then while I was traveling around and talking about Physic Book of Deliverance Dane so often, people would ask me, so Physic Book is about a graduate student named Connie Goodwin in 1990 who discovers that one of the Salem witches was the real thing, and that person was Deliverance Dane, unsurprisingly, who was a real person, although I heavily fictionalized her life, and I picked her because her name is so Puritan, Deliverance Dane, and it's also so metal. It's like the witchiest name ever, so I had to pick her. But in the course of talking about that book, very frequently I would be asked, what was the deal with the afflicted girls at Salem? Like, why were they doing that? What happened? What was the nature of their suffering? How could they have lived with themselves for causing all the trauma that they caused? And so the idea for Conversion, which was my first YA novel, kind of sprang fully formed into my head in response to those kinds of questions. Conversion is my clap back to Arthur Miller. It's my clap back to the Crucible. So it is about the afflicted girls, and it's told from the perspective of Ann Putnam Jr., who was actually the afflicted girl who accused and condemned more people to death than anyone else. And she's also the only person, the only one of the afflicted girls who issued an apology in 1705. And she, by the way, is left out of the Crucible. And so I thought, this is a really fascinating person, and I would like to have a story about her. So that led to me writing a couple of YA novels, which was really fun. And then the Anderson projects came about because he wanted to write a book about the Vanderbilts. And he had written a memoir before, and he had written a collection of correspondence between himself and his mother, who I think everybody knows was Gloria Vanderbilt. And as you can imagine, writing a history book is a bit of a different animal from those two things. And so word went out on the street, as it were, that he would need a co-author who had history chops and training, but who was accustomed to writing for a popular audience. And so I think they met with a few different people. And a few years later, he told me what actually got me the job in the course of my interview. And I can tell you if you want to know what got me the job. So I go through a couple of layers of being interviewed, being checked out and tested and whatnot. And finally, I'm invited to meet him and his agent and the publisher and all these very important people. So I put on my grown-up costume and I show up. And I'm talking about, here's how I think the book could look if we do it this way, we do it that way, because there are a number of ways you could approach the Vanderbilts. You could write a business history about the Vanderbilts and just talk about the railroads, but I thought it would be interesting to write more of a cultural history where we talk about women and we talk about families and we talk about what it feels like to live in these extraordinary circumstances. And certainly being a Vanderbilt in the Gilded Age is an extraordinary circumstance. So there I am with all these very important people, and I say, well, obviously we have to have a chapter about Alva's Ball. And they say, what's that? And I say, well, Alva's Ball, Alva Vanderbilt threw a party in 1883, the likes of which has never been seen before and is what broke the Vanderbilts into society. And so I would start describing the ball. It was a costume ball, a fancy dress ball. And of course, in the Gilded Age, that meant that you had to order your couture costume from Worth months in advance. And so I describe some of the costumes and things, and then I come to the description of the costume worn by Miss Kate Fearing Strong. Miss Kate Fearing Strong went costumed as a cat. Her costume consisted of a gown of white cat skins, a taxidermied white cat coiled up on top of her head, and a necklace that was a black velvet choker, spelled out in diamonds the word pussy. And that is how I got the job.
score.
Later, Anderson said, "That's the woman I want."
I don't even care if you can't write. That's hilarious. That is hilarious. Okay, 1681, 1915, 1726, 1930. What does it take to get into the minds of women from back then? Because it fascinates me about historical fiction writers, because here you are in this time. We have cell phones. We're a much different world. What does it take for you to get into those minds to be able to write something authentically?
I mean, I do the best that I can. I'm sure someone from one of those actual time periods would look at what I'm doing and laugh pretty hard. But I mean, the way that I go about it is I spend a lot of time in primary sources. So one of the things that's interesting about Salem, one of the reasons I'm attracted to Salem and also attracted to piracy is it's two rare times in the archive when regular people are at the center of the story and regular people are heavily documented. So you can actually read all of the Salem papers, the trial transcripts. There was somebody there writing everything down that was being said. And reading the trial transcripts is actually a fascinating exercise for a couple of different reasons. One, because it gives you a sense of how people talked, because it actually wrote down, what people said. On occasion, depending on who is doing the transcribing, the errors in spelling, it's before spelling had become standardized, so it can give you a sense of how people's accents sounded based on the ways that words were spelled. That's why Deliverance Dane's maiden name was either Hazelden, Hasseltine, Hazelden, Ingersoll is Ingerson, Ingersoll. You can kind of, all of the different variant spellings of these names change and give you a sense of kind of how the words sat in people's mouths, which is, I think, very interesting. And it's easier to read primary sources, of course, when you're talking about the 19-teens or the 1930s. For the 19-teens, I read a lot of a gossip magazine called Town Topics, which is lots of fun and has been completely digitized and is very juicy and was responsible for the breakup of Edith Wharton's marriage because they broke the news of Teddy Wharton's affair. So there's a lot of interesting stuff to be found in the archive. So I spend a lot of time in primary sources, and especially when possible, primary sources that give you a sense of how people talked.
I mean, and you can hear the student in your heart there. On page 47 of this book, Marion and Kay are looking at Hannah's account, and they're debating its authenticity. And I loved this line: people see what they expect to see in the places they expect to see them. Usually, people only see our context, not ourselves. What do you mean by that?
Well, a true account spends a lot of time thinking about representation and the ways, especially, that lots of people, I think everybody has to do this, but particularly, the book is particularly concerned with how women have to do it. How we have to appear a certain way to guarantee our safety. So that's obvious in the storyline where Hannah disguises herself as a cabin boy and goes pirating. Like, the way that she has to disguise herself is obvious. Marion, I think it's not a spoiler to say, we learn that Marion is gay. And she has to disguise herself because she's living in a moment in time when queerness was heavily policed. It was socially policed, but it was also literally policed. And so Marion has to worry about disguising herself that way. She has to kind of constantly worry about how she is seen. And in both timelines, there's a lot of attention paid to the way that the expectations of someone can affect how they see you. And so we discover, for instance, that Marion is looking at her student Kay with certain expectations. Like she herself, she's subject to the same kinds of assumptions that everyone else is in her time period. And so Kay surprises her because Marion had kind of made up her mind as to what kind of person Kay was based on Kay's context. And I think that that's something that we all sort of wrestle with. And of course, as a historian or someone who came to fiction writing from history, I spend a lot of time weighing the true, the untrue. Can something be emotionally true while being factually false? What is the boundary between what is true versus what is plausible? And so a true account, obviously, there's a meaning to the title. The truth of the account is always at issue when you're reading historical fiction. It's just more on the surface in a true account.
She's so smart.
Oh, go on.
Okay, let's switch gears back to Anderson Cooper.
Gladly.
What was that process like, and what did you learn from him about being a writer?
That's really, so Anderson works very, very hard. And one thing that we discovered is we reached the limit of what Google Docs can withstand. This was very funny. So we were collaborating, we needed a way to collaborate. And so we were, in Google Docs, you can have a document open at the same time and work on the same document with a couple of different people. And so at one point, we were both working on revisions so hard that the document kept freezing up. It kept freezing, and like we had to save it and then resave it as something else. And then we'd text each other and be like, "Are you in the document right now?" "Yes, I'm in the document right now." I sometimes joke that my husband is the real hero of Vanderbilt and Astor because I would regularly receive text messages at 11 o'clock at night from a very rich, successful, handsome celebrity. While I was like lying in bed, I'd be texting with him, and my husband was fine with it. Yeah, exactly. My husband was totally cool with it. So he's the unsung hero of those projects. But we did work very, very closely together. And one thing that I learned that was really fascinating was talking about truth. So I'm a historian. For a historian, what is true is what you can plausibly argue from the archive, given what you know. But he is a journalist. A journalist wants to know, what is the answer? And I'll give you the example that where I learned that those were actually two different things. So the question was, did the Vanderbilt family own enslaved people in the 1700s? Now, a historian would say, I'm the historian, there are many sort of apocryphal stories of Commodore Vanderbilt as a child working with or engaging with enslaved kids. There is a story of him being told by his mother to clear a field of rocks, and he recruits some children to help him, and the children help him clear the field of rocks, and then his mother gives him $100, and that's how he affords to buy his first sailboat, and that's what starts him on his fortune. You know, there are a couple of apocryphal stories like that. Then there is the fact that the way urban slavery worked at that time was anyone who could afford to have enslaved people did. Not a lot, probably just a couple, but the Vanderbilts were a farming family, a reasonably successful one. They had an inn for a time, and then they had a farm in Staten Island. Like, the historian says, it is plausible to argue that they probably did, but we don't know for sure. Did I find a list of names? No, I did not. Can I prove it? No, I cannot. And so, but for him, the question is, well, can we say that there is no list of names? We do not, that, and I said, no, we can't say that because there could be one. Like, we were writing Vanderbilt during COVID. We had very limited archive access for that book. It's quite possible that there is an archive that we did not get to or did not access in which this answer can be answered. So we can't disavow it that way. But he wanted to know, well, the answer is yes or no. Did they or didn't they? And of course, and that's the way a journalist thinks, because for journalism, you have to get down to the point. But a historian, we're all about the hedge and about plausibility. Hedge, plause. And so it was an interesting process to discover that we actually had, in some instances, a different definition of what is true.
Would you do it again? I mean, you did two, so would you do it again, co-writing with someone?
I think I would, yeah. I mean, I sort of floated an idea to him. He's been working really hard on, he has a very successful podcast on grief, which has been, a big something that he's been focusing on. So I don't know if we have another project in the works, but it was a really interesting process. I really enjoyed it. Also, he's very good at reining in my nerd. I don't know if you've noticed. I have a nerdy side. Have you noticed this?
But it's like a fun nerdy side. It's like
Thanks. So you talk about the Titanic. There's a chapter on Titanic in Astor because John Jacob Astor went down on Titanic. And as someone who'd already written a whole book about Titanic, I was trying to come up with a new way to talk about Titanic because we all know how it ends, right? It's hard to come up with a new way to tell that story. And so one thing I found was interesting was I looked at all the different film adaptations of Titanic, and John Jacob Astor is in all of them. And he is wildly different in all of them. In fact, did you know that there is a Nazi propaganda film called Titanic in which John Jacob Astor is the villain? He's the swine American capitalist who's betting against the White Star stock and is urging the boat to go too fast, and that's why it hits the iceberg. He is the villain of a Nazi propaganda film. Yeah, which I hate to admit, it's a really gripping. They knew how to do propaganda. It's called Titanic, and in fact, there are many shots that appear almost exactly in James Cameron's version. The one of Lightoller lowering the things looked at from below. That is a shot taken from a Joseph Goebbels film.
Wow, I need to watch this.
You do. So I said this would be an interesting thing to do, and Anderson said, yeah, but we also have to tell people like what actually happened on Titanic. And I said, do we though?
Like,
and he
know.
said, yes, we do.
May I get a time check? We started a little. Okay, thank you very much. So you have a relationship with Nantucket other than just this book festival. In fact, I tracked you down right after the Fagawi race to get a photo with you for that.
I do, but I'm afraid if there are any Nantucketers here, that they're going to be very upset with me if they find out I'm a Fagawi sailor, because I think we have a bad reputation.
No. So can you talk about that? Can you talk about that race and sailing, and then can you draw any parallels with sailing and writing?
Absolutely. So I did my very first Fagawi in 2007. Okay. I was a baby grad student. I wasn't even a novelist yet. I did my very first Fagawi. I started.
Did you party in the tent?
Yes.
Ooh.
I hesitate to share this because we are mixed company, but are you aware that there's a secret society of joke tellers associated with Fagawi?
I do not know that.
I'm in this secret society of dirty joke tellers at Fagawi.
I think I could tell that with your little cat story there.
Meow.
Meow.
Yes, it was a lot of fun. So I started sailing when we moved to Marblehead in grad school, and I discovered one of the great things about sailboat racing is everybody needs crew, and so if you want to go sailing for free, you can, because if you're a warm body with a positive attitude is willing to show up, and it helps if you can hold your rum, which I can. And so I started sailing when we moved to Marblehead in 2006, and then the boat that I crewed on did Fagawi in 2007 and has done it just about every year, except the years that it was not on for COVID. In fact, my last appearance in the joke tent, because they didn't have the joke tent this year, tragedy, it's probably for the best. My last appearance in the joke tent was in 2019, and I was visibly pregnant, which is great for telling dirty jokes.
I mean, I kind of want to hear one, but maybe these are filmed. This is a family program.
I opened by saying I had a busy off season, and everybody laughed. And then I said, and so that reminds me, I'm going to have to speak to about 4 or 5 of you afterwards. There's some paperwork you need to sign.
But
no, it's terrible.
Before we get to a couple of audience questions, and I know we're running a little late, I love to do speed rounds with any author that I interview. So
golly,
are you ready?
On. Will I know the answers?
Yes, you will.
Okay.
Favorite book as a kid?
Eloise.
Favorite book as a teen?
Eloise.
Can you pick a favorite novel? That's a really hard question.
The Age of Innocence.
What question would you ask Elizabeth Howe?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one. I honestly don't know. That one would be too. I can't boil that down to a speed round, I'm sorry to say.
No problem. If you could invite 5 people to your dinner table, dead or alive, who would they be?
Ooh. Well, this is going to be very sentimental. My mother. I'd like to see my mother again. I'd invite my mother. I'd invite Edith Wharton. That would be interesting. Could talk about writing with her, and also
just like you.
And also, my mother would really like to meet her. That would be fun. I might invite Zachariah Gage Lampson, because he's a great grandfather who's the one who faced down pirates. He was a mariner from Beverly in the early part of the 19th century. And I've read a lot about him. He left a partial memoir that is actually a lot of fun if you're a sailor and someone who likes historical fiction, which are 2 probably big ifs. But I find it to be a pretty fun read. And he seems like kind of an interesting character. And then, let's see, how many is that? 3. And then for the other 2, I think my husband and my son. Although my son is a ham, and so he would dominate the conversation. And Edith Wharton would disapprove of my son's behavior at the dinner table, I'm sure.
And then the final question, what are you working on next?
Well, I'm finishing my doctorate over the summer, which is fun. So I'm going to do that. And then I'm working on, I have 2 competing novel ideas. The one that will probably win out is I'm thinking, having spent a lot of time thinking about the Gilded Age with Astor and with Vanderbilt, I've been thinking it would be fun to do a Gilded Age Bonfire of the Vanities, like a big, thick New York society, like the way the Bonfire of the Vanities was the end of the go-go 80s. I want to have this be the end of the go-go 1890s. and I have an idea for an inciting incident, and I want this like a similar sort of structure. So I don't have a working title, though I'm privately I'm calling it Bonfire, my Bonfire novel.
I'm here for it. I'm here
Thanks.
for it. We have time for maybe like 2 questions. Anyone have any questions for Katherine?
Anderson is as lovely in person as he seems to be on television. He's very, very nice.
Sarah, I'll come bring you the mic.
Do you have any special powers? Do you feel witchy?
The question is, if I'm descended from witches, do I have special powers? Do I feel witchy? Well, so my husband claims that I can destroy technology with my very presence. And it's actually, I feel like statistically, too many streetlights turn off when I walk under them. So maybe?
Another question?
You mentioned naive idiots earlier. We see this in the news a lot, especially lately on college campuses. And when you have a mob mentality combined with naive idiots, especially when you go back to the Salem witch era, it's extremely scary and dangerous. And what would you say about that as far as like the mob and people interested in observing bad things happening to people that are different than them?
That's a great question. One thing that keeps occurring to me as I, watch things unfolding and watch the discourse unfolding is actually an example from Salem, unsurprisingly, since I think about Salem a lot. When Elizabeth Proctor was tried as a witch, one of the tests that they put her to was that they asked her to recite the Lord's Prayer, and she did. And when she came to the word hallowed, in hallowed be thy name, a couple of people thought she said hollowed, as in empty. And that was part of what participated in condemning her to die. And the reason that I think about that so much is because it underscores to me the difference between listening for and listening to. And so I go back to that example in my mind a lot these days because there's a danger in listening for instead of listening to, because sometimes the person who is speaking is saying the truthful thing, the right thing, and you're not listening for it, and you're not listening to it.
Wow. Did you two plan this? That was an excellent question and fascinating answer. One more?
Hi, I don't know what clapback means when you say.
Oh, it's something the youth say. It just means response to, like critical
Okay.
response to, so Arthur Miller, has this kind of dominant narrative in some ways, still rather dominant narrative, but it is so inflected by a 1950s perspective, not just in terms of its, representations about communism, but also its gender politics. He puts John Proctor's sexuality and moral torture at the center of the story, when Salem is really a story about women. Salem is a story about women, and it's about girls who are accusing women. There are men in the Salem story, but they are very peripheral when you come right down to it. And so conversion is my critical pushback against the dominant narrative that is explicitly taught in the Crucible.
Okay, thank you.
Katherine, thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for joining me.
For me and for everyone here.
It was such a pleasure. And I will only add, anyone who wants to keep up with me, I have a website, which is katherinehowe.com, and I have lately begun a Substack, which you can, if you want to. I only write when I actually have something to say, not to worry.
The how and the why. I love it. I love that play on words.
So thank you all so much for being here today.